From UFOs to psychic powers and government conspiracies, history is riddled with unexplained events. You can turn back now or learn the stuff they don't want you to know.
And as promised, we're back with one more piece of strange news. This one comes from the United States of America, and it concerns privacy, but not necessarily your privacy or my privacy. This is specifically the privacy of those who are incarcerated, because as we know, there is such a thing as attorney-client privilege. That information is not supposed to be admissible in court proceedings, and when you enter into a conversation with your attorney, it's supposed to be, sacrosanct, like a confession to a priest or something. But I think even confessions or like client patient privilege, like with a therapist, there are rules where if you think someone is going to do something, you are supposed to, tell the authorities. But I believe, the idea of speaking to your attorney is not meant to be listened to, even though some other telephone calls from, prisons are monitored, personal phone calls. These calls between an incarcerated person and their attorney are not supposed to be being the operating word here. But we have found out recently that this has not been the case. And there's one company that services prison telephone systems across the country that is at the heart of this scandal. The story starts in Brooklyn, New York, and this comes from an article in Vice, where I got hip to the story by Ella Fassler that goes into this whole thing. But let's start from the beginning. In Brooklyn, an organization called Brooklyn Defender Services believed that phone calls of many of their clients, this is an advocacy type group that believed that many of their clients' phone calls with their lawyers were in fact being recorded. And we know that these are protected under things like the Sixth Amendment and the Federal Wiretap Act. But this organization was very distrustful of the system in Brooklyn, the phone system that was being used, and they called for an audit of these phone calls and which ones were being recorded. Again, personal ones, totally permissible. The lawyer ones, not supposed to be recorded. So Elizabeth Daniel Vasquez, who's the director of the Science and Surveillance Project at Brooklyn Defender Services, told Vice's Motherboard that there was a general sense of unease around this time. And around 2019, defense attorneys learned that prosecutors had handed over attorney-client phone call recordings during the period of the trial called discovery, where evidence is exchanged and admitted or not admitted into evidence, the official record. Apparently, though, these phone recordings of these very privileged calls, some of them were given exceptions and entered into to discovery. After quite a few more of these calls surfaced, Brooklyn Defender Services Civil Rights Counsel, a woman named Brooke Menschel, went to the Department of Corrections, who assured her that no, we fixed all the problems. There's no issue here, nothing to see here. So Brooklyn Defender Services demanded they do an audit. And from that audit, they discovered that more than 1,500 of these protected phone calls had been recorded. And this is something that would have affected around 350 cases. And this has been reported from the New York Daily News, and the New York Post has done some reporting on this as well. And at the heart of this is a company called Sakura, LOL, Technologies. And their inability to distinguish between these personal calls and these private attorney-client calls. So, yeah, they uncovered 1,500 of these protected calls being recorded, And apparently, this is just the tip of the iceberg, as Vice reports. Another advocacy organization, Worth Rises, and also Motherboard, that did some analysis of court documents and local news articles. Sakura apparently, allegedly, has recorded tens of thousands of phone calls between attorneys and their incarcerated clients in 7 other states. And this is based on lawsuits that have been filed and other reports from California, Kansas, Louisiana, Maine, Missouri, Texas, Wisconsin. And that is all just Securus. Another prison, telecom company, I guess, called Global Tellink, GTL, allegedly has recorded phone calls with attorneys in Florida, California, and Maine as well. So not a good look. And this is definitely an ongoing story. Securus, was reached out to by these organizations and by Vice. And this is what they said in response to Motherboard's request for a comment. Quote, "The occasional inadvertent recordings are not evidence of a systemic practice. In fact, it is quite the opposite. Issues involving the inadvertent recording of calls to attorney numbers involve less than 0.1% of all calls on the Securus platform, demonstrating that these issues are rare and occasional, not systematic."
Okay. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Sorry, officer. This is the first time I ever tried crack. I thought you bought it by the pound. Like, I don't know, man. I mean, I give them the benefit of a doubt, I guess, you guys, but that feels, coupled with how corrupt the prison phone call system is already, any conspiracy realist who's been unfortunate enough to be incarcerated for one reason or another, if you've been in the stir, if you've been locked up for any kind of long amount of time, then you know that in many states, up until the COVID-19 pandemic, there was a lot of inequality because phone calls were incredibly overpriced.
Right. I was only aware of that because I got locked up one time for a silly thing. It was like a bench warrant that was out for me for a ticket I hadn't paid. But A, it took me forever to get a call, and B, I had to call collect because I only had one number memorized, and it was like my mom's, and it ended up being incredibly expensive. It was like, $60 or something like that. But that was because it was collect. But if you're incarcerated, it's a little less than that. But if you think about the frequency of these calls, it adds up. But how much are they looking at today, Ben?
The Prison Policy Initiative reported that a 15-minute phone call could cost as much as $24.82. So hashtag, they did the math. If you divide that cost, what you see is it's more than it's like $1.65 per minute, which feels like a 900 line at that point, especially when people are in one of the worst times of their life. Luckily, at least in response to the pandemic, back in 2020, April, the Federal Bureau of Prisons did say that, at least in federal pens, telephone and video calls would be free of charge. But I'm just saying that to say, like, if you're aware of that context, I think it's completely understandable how a lot of people would say, okay, I'm sure it's an accident that you happen to listen in. It just seems like rife for corruption against a very disadvantaged population. You know what I mean? No matter how they ended up in there, people do have rights.
Really quickly, guys, I don't disagree with everything you're saying. I'm coming at this from the only experience that I have with the Sakura system, and it was when we were making Atlanta Monster, and we were trying to be able to talk to Wayne Williams. And we had to go through this ridiculous system of connecting that phone number from which we would be dialing from and receiving calls from, like linking it to our group and to an individual and making sure that that system knew exactly who we were, right? So in response to this Vice article, I think one of the ones that you use for this research, Noel, the company, Securus, is saying if somebody doesn't go through the system and sets up that number to be private or non-recorded, then that phone call is going to get recorded, because they're just default recorded. unless they're, the number is associated with some very specific
excluded in some
data
way.
set.
Yeah, that makes sense. Now that makes sense, Matt. That's a really good context. My question is, the one part of this Vice article that kind of threw me, and I need to do a little more digging. This might even be, a larger episode down the line, but they were saying these folks from the Brooklyn Defender Services are talking about how client attorney phone calls were submitted in discovery. And wouldn't those automatically be excluded from being used as evidence? Like, just the fact that it exists doesn't make it legal to use against somebody. I mean, even if the call was recorded, you shouldn't be able to actually submit that or admit that as evidence in a case, right?
Yeah, I think you could. I think that's a good question, because you could, someone could try to use it or try to use some information attained via it that led them to some other evidence. And if they can reasonably rationalize a different avenue toward that evidence, it might get a little tricky. But surely a judge would, like if a case makes it to trial, surely a judge would be right in saying this is inadmissible, right?
Right.
Surely.
I guess it would have to be really some dirty dealing to kind of hide the chain of custody or like where it actually came from. Because I would think if it was known that it was an illegally recorded phone call, done from prison between a client and their attorney, that would be, a non-starter. Wouldn't you think, Matt, based on your Atlanta Monster stuff as well?
I think so, but I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know, man. This whole thing is really disturbing.
It is. But I also am like, does it really matter if they're being recorded, if they're not ending up in the hands of people that would use them nefariously? Is that the implication? Is that the implication that they, of course, are ending up in the hands of people that would use them unfairly? Yeah, please, Matt.
That's why we have a system of trials, right? Each person has a right to defend themselves, and if you're taking counsel with somebody to find a way to defend yourself the most efficiently, no matter whether you did a crime or not. I mean, that's like part of the whole system. I was going to say game, which it is in a weird way a game, but I don't know. At least within our system of laws right now, you got to have that protected communication. And that includes, even if it's just a system that records it by default and it just stays in a file on a hard drive somewhere, right?
It shouldn't exist. Right? It shouldn't exist.
That's what I'm saying. Yeah,
I agree. I agree with you.
Yeah, 100%. I think we're all on the same page. And again, this is not any of us being cheerleaders for crime or what have you. It's just that if you take a larger picture perspective and you think through this, the rights that are guaranteed in theory, again, to people who are incarcerated are enormously important. No matter how they got there, there's a reason that the law exists. Those rights in practice, obviously, they're obviously not holding up to what they're supposed to be in theory. You need look no further than prisons in Scandinavian countries to see the difference in how people treat incarceration. Like some of those prisons are like better than people's apartments, but still.
Absolutely. They look like those model IKEA apartments, I mean, like really, really clean lines and nice, tasteful decor, comfy mattresses and all that. If a little austere, but nothing like what we see in American prisons, which are, for the long-term stays can be absolutely inhumane. But yeah, I think it's something to keep an eye on. And it's, I'm interested to see where this goes. This is a pretty new story and it is still developing. But, and it's like these types of, prisoner advocacy groups are really important because left unchecked, either the system won't work like it's supposed to because it's not being checked or looked in upon and held to a high standard, or just rampant corruption will absolutely happen in the dark if no one's checking in. So these kind of watchdog groups are incredibly important for folks' civil rights. I know I'm just saying good job to the folks over at the Brooklyn Defender Services organization.